So levity and gravity, what's that about? Well, gravity is what we all hear about. It's the primary force that dictates all life, or the suppression of life, more accurately, because what does gravity do? It keeps us anchored on the ground. It suppresses, like a gravitational pull, it suppresses things downward. So we all get that idea. It's kind of like entropy. You guys know what that is, entropy? It's a breakdown product of the universal laws, if you will, is that everything is chaos, everything is subject to decay, die, right? Yeah, it's like entropy. But we never hear about, well, how does life start? How does life occur? How does a newborn baby come into being? If it was all about entropy, then we wouldn't have a vibrant, beautiful, buoyant baby come into the world. We wouldn't have trees growing up, right? There's a counterbalance there. So the aging cycle, to understand the life cycle and how our metabolic life cycle works, and how to understand the longevity puzzle to really get what's been found out through longevity science, is that we need to start entertaining more levitative qualities. So that's what I'm gonna kind of bring forth right in this idea, is that when you go through the aging sequence, as you grow older, you start to become gravitationally pulled down, right? Kind of like the Yoda archetype after 900 years, right? He becomes crippled, elderly, Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? The classical depiction of an elderly person. Although that depiction, if you take a depiction of someone who's 90 in America and someone who's 90 in some indigenous culture, like the Hunzas or the Okinawans or something like that, two different archetypes, aren't they? Right? You see one characteristic, typically, in our Western culture, is someone is just like, they have knee braces, they have canes, they have root canals, they have electronic things built into their body, whatever the case is, right? And they're breaking down and they're crippling down and they're being suppressed to the ground, right? That's the gravity idea. But the other side of it is that we are actually empowered by levitative forces in the world. One of those forces is the motherboard of the earth. Grounding. If you study the research on grounding, it's very interesting because all the things we associate as being healing components or longevity enhancing qualities, grounding fits every single one of them. It's the most powerful anti-inflammatory in the world. It'll thin your blood better than anything. And so much so that if somebody's on blood thinning medication, they can't immediately do excessive grounding, because it could thin their blood too much. Does that make sense? So the number one anti-inflammatory is ground. Just to put that out there. Just to put it out there. It's free. Just like the sun, just like the water, just like clean air. You might have to get a HEPA filter or something, but basically it's free energy technology, right? And so this also translates to food, right? I just want to present the level of obviousness that comes from. You know, I got really into this idea that you can't heal something by putting something dead into your body, right? You can't get life by ingesting or entertaining death. There's all kinds of nuances to that. There's all kinds of ideas around that, but the premise is pretty accurate. If you want to increase levitative qualities, for example, walking upright, bipedal, right? Like human beings are bipedal mammals. You guys know what bipedal means? Two-legged and upright, right? So like a bear or a gorilla or an ape or something, they're on all fours, right? But what's different about humans is that we have evolved to walk upright. We're bipedal. That's a levitative quality. Does that make sense? It's a levitative quality. If there was no levity being the life force, then we would be suppressed and we would be crunching down. A tree, You know, a tree uprises through the surface of the earth and then comes up. I think I've drilled that enough times, right? And so the food that we ingest and the certain little tips and tricks that we're going to play with today, we're going to work with a levitative principle. Things that increase blood flow, things that increase neurological function, things that increase myelination, which is basically the nerve insulation of your fibers that keep you able to, your circuitry is on, right? So everything is online, your neurocircuitry is good, you're not freaking out, you don't have like motor dysfunctions and like MS, Parkinson's, that kind of thing.
What was that word?
What's that? Myelination. Yeah, so myelin is the fatty coating that surrounds your nerve fibers. And once that fiber, or that insulation material, which is about 85% fat, DHA, omega-3 fatty acids, and saturated fat in particular, build that myelin that coats the nerve fibers, right? But once that gets oxidized and cut through with like heavy metals like mercury toxicity, and just oxidized oils is another one, rancid oils, then it starts to desheath and then your nerves start to get fried. Make sense, right? And then from the hormonal perspective, this is obviously where we're going to go with it. Hormones, definitively, you could look at hormones, they're the chemical messengers in the body, they're the master switches of metabolism. That's one perspective. I take the other perspective too, is that hormones are levitative, the right hormones, right? And some hormones are catabolic, meaning that they break things down, right? Some are anabolic, growth, repair, rejuvenation. What are those? Those are like human growth hormone, like testosterone, progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, thyroid stimulating hormone, when that complex is in alignment. Adrenaline too. That's what I wanted to bring up, is that the reason we can actually move upright is because we're adrenalized. We're adrenalized. That's a good kind of thing to know about, is that adrenaline is what actually allows us to move upright and move around. And then cortisol is typically catabolic. Cortisol is the fight or flight hormone we've all heard about. So when people have excess of cortisol, it pushes out our androgenic hormones or our growth and rejuvenating hormones. So for women, that's progesterone. For men, that's testosterone. Just to distill that, right? So when we're too stressed out, it has a catabolic or crippling effect on the physical body, right? So that's actually what we're going to kind of meander into right now, is that what I find really interesting is that when you start to look at relationship dynamics, what's the number one stress among people in the 21st century? What do you guys think?
Money.
What stresses you out? Money is like the number one reason for marital disputes? Lack consciousness. Right, okay, so lack consciousness is like a reservoir, and then out of that reservoir comes these things that we associate, like behaviors that come out of lack, right? So like a focus on money being, I don't have enough money, or identifying yourself with money, like my value is based on my net worth instead of my network, my community, my relationships, right? Getting into that kind of thing, that creates catabolic effects in the body and pushes out these growth hormones that we're talking about. So taking that a step further, it's interesting how men and women deal with stress differently. And I think once we really get an understanding of this, what ends up happening is we have more of an understanding with our partner, with the opposite sex, when we just understand like, oh wow, you're actually different than me. Other than the obvious. You actually respond to life differently, biochemically, naturally, indigenously. The epigenetic transference of our ancestors is actually being brought into our physical characteristics. The wounds, the traumas, the resentments, all that stuff is actually epigenetically, one generation to the next, is being genetically to a lesser degree, but it's being replicated every generation out, right? That's an important idea to consider too, as a lot of people in this audience might be doing a lot of like, I don't know, past life regression, hypnotherapy, wound, trauma, release work. Understand that one of the ways that we keep stress contained in the physical body is we personalize ourselves to the stress, to the trauma. We think, geez, I unlayer this trauma, and then this whole bag of worms comes up, and now I got to go deal with that, right? So it's kind of like this idea that at some point we are healed. At some point in our journey, we're actually healed. We don't have to keep going back and like, all right, I got to heal myself of this. I got to heal this. It's like, no, that's a regressive characteristic. We want to progress, right? Even just psychologically, like, no, I'm healed. Even if the evidence of it is contrary, I'm healed. HOPE. The number one healing force, the number one healing frequency that anybody can adopt and really work with is an attitude of HOPE.